The truth about sin that no one talks about anymore. There is a silence in modern conversations about sin, a silence so deep that many have mistaken it for truth. In a world where everything is reframed, softened, or rebranded, sin has become one of the most misunderstood and avoided concepts of all. It is either dismissed as an outdated religious construct or reduced to nothing more than personal mistakes, bad habits, or human flaws. But the truth is far more unsettling and far more important. Sin is not merely about breaking rules. It is not just about morality. It is not simply about right and wrong in a cultural sense. Sin is something deeper, more internal, more invisible and more dangerous than most people are willing to admit. It is a force, a condition, a distortion that affects the human heart at its core. The reason no one talks about it anymore is not because it is irrelevant. It is because it is uncomfortable, because it confronts us, because it strips away our excuses, because it reveals that the real battle is not out there in the world, but within us. Most people today want spirituality without conviction. They want purpose without accountability. They want peace without transformation. And in that pursuit, sin becomes the one topic that must be ignored because it stands in the way of a comfortable illusion. But here is the truth. Ignoring sin does not remove it. Silence does not weaken it. Redefining it does not change its nature. It continues to operate quietly, shaping decisions, influencing thoughts, and distancing people from the life they were meant to live. And that is why this conversation matters. In this deep exploration, we are going beyond surface-level explanations. We are going to uncover what sin really is, how it works, why it feels so natural, and why most people never recognize its true power. This is not about condemnation. It is about clarity. It is about seeing what has been hidden in plain sight. Because once you understand sin, not as a concept, but as a reality, you begin to see your life, your struggles, and your inner conflicts in a completely different way. And perhaps, for the first time, things will start to make sense. Sin is not just what you do, it's what you become. One of the greatest misconceptions about sin is that it is merely about actions. People tend to think in simple terms. If I do something wrong, that is sin. If I avoid doing wrong, then I am fine. But this way of thinking is dangerously incomplete, because sin is not just about behavior, it is about transformation. Not transformation towards something better, but a slow, often invisible transformation away from who you were created to be. Sin is not just something you commit, it is something that begins to shape you. Think about it. Every repeated action creates a pattern. Every pattern forms a habit. Every habit over time forms a character. And character determines destiny. Sin operates within this chain, but in a subtle and deceptive way. At first, it feels small. Just a thought, just a compromise, just a moment. Something easy to justify, something easy to hide, something easy to forget. But sin rarely stays small. Its power lies in its ability to normalize itself. What once felt wrong begins to feel acceptable. What once created discomfort begins to feel natural. And eventually, what once disturbed your conscience becomes part of your identity. This is where the real danger begins. Because when sin becomes part of who you are, you no longer see it as a problem. You defend it. You rationalize it, you build your life around it without even realizing it. And this is why many people are stuck, not because they lack desire to change, but because they no longer recognize what needs to change. Sin reshapes perception. It convinces you that you are fine when you are not. It tells you that everyone else is the problem. It whispers that growth is unnecessary, that conviction is outdated, that self-examination is too extreme. And slowly, without any dramatic moment, you drift. not in a way that feels like falling, but in a way that feels like settling into comfort, settling into patterns, settling into a version of yourself that is far removed from your original design. This is why sin is often described not just as disobedience, but as separation, not just separation from God, but separation from truth, from clarity, from purpose, from your own potential. And the tragedy is that this separation does not always feel painful. Sometimes it feels peaceful. Sometimes it feels like freedom. Sometimes it feels like relief. But it is not. Because true freedom does not come from ignoring what is wrong within you. It comes from confronting it. And that is the part most people avoid. Because confronting sin requires honesty. It requires humility. It requires the willingness to admit that something inside you is misaligned. And in a world that constantly tells you to accept yourself as you are, that kind of honesty feels almost rebellious. But here is the deeper truth. You were never meant to stay as you are. Growth requires change. Transformation requires awareness. And awareness begins with recognizing that sin is not just about isolated mistakes. It is about the direction of your life. Every choice either aligns you with truth or pulls you further away from it. And over time, those choices shape not just your actions, but your identity. So the real question is not simply, what am I doing? The real question is, what am I becoming? Because that is where sin does its most powerful work. Not in the visible moments that everyone can see, but in the quiet, internal shifts that no one notices until it is too late. And if you are willing to be honest with yourself, even for a moment, you may begin to see patterns you have ignored. You may begin to recognize habits that have shaped you. You may begin to understand why certain struggles keep repeating, not because you are weak, but because something deeper has been at work all along. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, which is exactly where real transformation begins. Sin thrives in justification, not rebellion. One of the most dangerous lies ever believed is that sin primarily exists in open rebellion, in obvious wrongdoing, in extreme behavior, in actions that clearly violate what is right. This belief creates a false sense of security. It allows people to look at their lives and say, I'm not that bad, simply because they are not doing what they consider extreme or visibly destructive. But the truth is far more unsettling. Sin rarely begins with rebellion. It begins with justification. Rebellion is loud. It is visible. It is easy to recognize. But justification is quiet. It hides behind logic. It disguises itself as reason. It feels intelligent, even mature. And because of that, it is far more dangerous. Justification allows sin to exist without resistance. It doesn't tell you that what you are doing is right. It simply convinces you that it is not that wrong. And that small shift changes everything. Because once you no longer see something as wrong, you no longer fight against it. And once you stop fighting, it begins to grow. This is how sin becomes deeply rooted in a person's life, not through one dramatic decision, but through a series of small, reasonable compromises. It's not that serious. Everyone does this. I deserve this. I've been through a lot. I'm not hurting anyone. I'll stop later. Each of these thoughts seems harmless on its own. In fact, they feel rational, they feel balanced, they feel like a healthy way to navigate life. But they all serve the same purpose, to lower the standard just enough to make sin comfortable. And comfort is where sin becomes powerful. Because when something feels comfortable, you stop questioning it, you stop examining it, you stop challenging it, you begin to build your life around it. This is why many people live in patterns they don't even realize are destructive, not because they are ignorant, but because they have justified those patterns to the point where they no longer appear harmful. Sin does not need you to openly reject truth. It only needs you to slightly redefine it, to blur the lines, to soften the edges, to make everything feel relative instead of absolute. And once that happens, conviction disappears. Not because truth has changed, but because your perception of truth has changed. This is the internal shift that few people talk about. The moment when you no longer feel tension between what you are doing and what you know is right. The moment when your conscience becomes quieter. The moment when self-reflection becomes uncomfortable, so you avoid it. The moment when growth feels unnecessary because everything seems fine. That is not peace. That is not maturity. That is not freedom. That is the result of prolonged justification. Because true peace does not come from avoiding conflict within, it comes from resolving it. And if there is no internal conflict, it does not mean everything is aligned. Sometimes it means something inside you has stopped resisting. That is why justification is so dangerous. It removes the very tension that leads to transformation. Without tension, there is no awareness. Without awareness, there is no change. Without change, there is stagnation. And stagnation over time leads to decay. But here is where it becomes even more subtle. Justification often disguises itself as self-compassion. It tells you that being too hard on yourself is unhealthy. It tells you that guilt is toxic. It tells you that you should embrace yourself fully, without judgment. And while there is truth in those ideas, they become dangerous when they eliminate accountability. Because there is a difference between compassion and permission. Compassion acknowledges your struggles while still calling you higher. Permission removes the need to rise at all, and sin thrives in permission. It thrives in environments where nothing is challenged, where everything is accepted, where growth is optional. It thrives where there is no urgency to change, and that is exactly the environment modern thinking often creates, a world where everything is relative, where truth is subjective, where right and wrong are seen as personal opinions rather than objective realities. In such a world, sin does not need to fight for space. It is given space freely. Because no one wants to define it. No one wants to confront it. No one wants to admit that something might actually be wrong. And so everything becomes acceptable. Everything becomes normalized. Everything becomes justified. Until one day, you look at your life and realize something is off. You feel disconnected. You feel restless. You feel like something is missing, but you cannot explain what. Because the issue is not external, it is internal. It is the accumulation of small compromises that were never challenged. It is the result of living in a constant state of justification. And the only way out of that cycle is honesty. Not surface-level honesty, deep honesty, the kind that forces you to question your own reasoning, the kind that makes you uncomfortable, the kind that reveals patterns you have ignored. Because until you remove justification, you cannot see clearly. And until you see clearly, you cannot change. That is why the first step toward transformation is not behavior. It is awareness. Awareness of how you think. Awareness of how you justify. Awareness of the quiet ways sin has become acceptable in your life. Because once you see it, the illusion breaks. And once the illusion breaks, you are faced with a choice: continue justifying or start transforming. And that choice is where everything changes. Sin rewires your desires. You start wanting what destroys you. One of the most unsettling truths about sin is not just that it influences what you do, but that it gradually reshapes what you want. This is where the real battle begins, because as long as you still desire what is right, there is tension, there is resistance, there is a fight inside you. And that fight, even when exhausting, is a sign that something within you is still alive, still aligned, still capable of change. But sin does not only operate at the level of action, it goes deeper into your desires. At first, there is a clear distinction. You know what is right, and you know what you are doing is not. There is discomfort, there is hesitation, there is even guilt. But if that pattern continues, if that behavior is repeated without interruption, something begins to shift. The discomfort fades, the hesitation disappears, the guilt becomes quieter, and then something even more dangerous happens. You begin to want what you once resisted. This is the moment when sin transitions from being external to being internalized. It is no longer something you fall into. It becomes something you pursue. And when desire changes, everything changes. Because behavior follows desire. You don't need to force yourself anymore. You don't need to justify it as much. You don't need to struggle in the same way. It feels natural. It feels normal. It feels like you, and that is the most deceptive part. Because when something feels like you stop questioning it. You assume it is authentic. You assume it is part of your identity. You assume it is simply who you are. But not everything that feels natural is aligned with truth. Some things feel natural because they have been repeated long enough to become familiar. And familiarity is powerful. It creates comfort. It creates attachment. It creates a sense of belonging, even to things that are slowly destroying you. This is why many people find themselves trapped in cycles they don't understand. They say things like, "I don't know why I keep going back to this. I know it's not good for me, but I still want it. I feel like I can't change." What they are experiencing is not just lack of discipline, it is altered desire. Sin has rewired their internal compass. And once your desires are misaligned, external solutions are not enough. Because you are not just fighting your actions, you are fighting your inclinations. This is why transformation is so difficult, because it is not just about stopping something. It is about retraining your heart. It is about learning to desire differently. And that is a process that most people are not prepared for. Because it requires patience, it requires consistency, it requires a willingness to endure discomfort without immediately escaping it. You have to sit in the tension. You have to resist what feels natural. You have to choose what is right even when it does not feel right. And that goes against everything the modern world teaches. Today, people are told, follow your heart, trust your feelings, do what makes you happy. But what if your heart has been shaped by patterns that are not healthy? What if your feelings are not reliable? What if what makes you happy in the moment leads to emptiness in the long run? This is the contradiction few people want to face, that your desires are not always a guide. Sometimes they are a result of what you have fed your mind, a result of what you have practiced, a result of what you have normalized. And if you want to change your life, you cannot ignore that. You cannot simply wait until you feel like doing what is right, because if your desires are misaligned, that feeling may never come. You have to act before you feel. You have to choose before it becomes easy. You have to move in a direction that feels unnatural, until over time it becomes your new nature. This is how transformation actually works, not through sudden breakthroughs, but through consistent, often uncomfortable decisions that slowly reshape your inner world. At first it feels forced, then it feels intentional, then it feels natural, and eventually it becomes who you are. But the same process works in reverse. If you consistently give in to destructive patterns, they become natural, they become part of you, they define you. This is why sin is so powerful. Because it does not just pull you away from truth, it convinces you that what is pulling you away is what you truly want. And once you believe that, resistance feels pointless, change feels unnecessary, growth feels optional. But here is the truth that breaks that illusion. You are not your current desires. You are shaped by them, but you are not defined by them. They can change. They can be redirected. They can be transformed, but only if you are willing to challenge them, only if you are willing to question what you feel, only if you are willing to admit that not everything within you is aligned with where you want to go. Because the moment you accept every desire as truth, you surrender your ability to grow. But the moment you begin to examine them, you reclaim your power. And that is where real change begins, not when everything feels right, but when you choose what is right, despite how you feel. And over time, that choice reshapes everything: your habits, your mindset, your identity, and eventually, your desires. But it all starts with one uncomfortable realization. Just because you want something doesn't mean it's leading you to life. Sometimes it's leading you away from it, and recognizing that is the beginning of wisdom. Sin numbs your conscience until you no longer feel it. There is something deeply alarming about the human ability to adapt. Adaptation, in many ways, is a gift. It allows you to endure hardship, to grow through difficulty, to survive environments that would otherwise break you. But that same ability, when applied to sin, becomes one of the most dangerous mechanisms within you, because what you tolerate, you eventually normalize. And what you normalize, you eventually stop feeling. This is how sin numbs the conscience. At the beginning, there is awareness. You feel it, you sense it. There is a subtle internal signal that something is off. It may not be loud, but it is present. A tension, a discomfort, a quiet resistance within you that says, "This is not right." That voice, often ignored, often dismissed, is your conscience. And in its early stages, it is sensitive, it reacts quickly, it responds clearly. It creates friction between what you are doing and what you know is true. But here is where the danger begins. If you ignore that voice repeatedly, it does not stay the same. It weakens, not because it disappears, but because you have trained yourself not to listen. Every time you override your conscience, you reinforce a pattern. You teach yourself that the signal does not matter. You prove to yourself that you can move forward without responding to it. And over time, that signal becomes quieter. Not because truth has changed, but because your sensitivity to it has decreased. This is what it means to have a numbed conscience. You are still capable of recognizing right and wrong, but the urgency is gone. The emotional weight is gone. The internal resistance is gone. What once felt heavy now feels light. What once felt wrong now feels neutral. What once disturbed you now barely registers. And this is where sin becomes deeply embedded. Because without a functioning conscience, there is no internal correction. There is no alarm system. There is no friction. Everything feels smooth, even when it is leading you in the wrong direction. This is why people can live in patterns that are clearly destructive, yet feel completely at peace with them. Not because those patterns are harmless, but because their ability to perceive harm has been dulled. And this dulling does not happen overnight. It happens gradually, quietly, almost imperceptibly. A small compromise here, a justified decision there, a repeated behavior that slowly becomes routine. And with each step, the conscience adjusts. It lowers its volume. It reduces its intensity, until one day, it barely speaks at all. This is often described as becoming hardened. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a subtle, internal way. A loss of sensitivity, a loss of responsiveness, a loss of awareness. And the most dangerous part is that it feels normal, because you have nothing to compare it to. You don't remember what it felt like to be more sensitive. You don't realize what has been lost. You simply continue living, unaware that something essential within you has changed. This is why many people are not actively resisting truth. They simply cannot feel it anymore. The signals are too weak. The awareness is too low. The internal clarity is too clouded. And without that clarity, there is no motivation to change, because change requires recognition, and recognition requires sensitivity. But here is the part that most people never hear. A numbed conscience is not permanent. It can be restored, but not without effort, not without discomfort, not without a willingness to confront what you have been avoiding. Because reawakening your conscience means increasing your sensitivity again. It means paying attention to what you feel. It means noticing the small signals. It means slowing down enough to recognize when something is off. And at first, this can be overwhelming, because when sensitivity returns, so does awareness. And with awareness comes realization. You begin to see patterns you ignored. You begin to feel the weight of decisions you minimized. You begin to recognize the distance between where you are and where you could be. And that can be uncomfortable, even painful. But it is also necessary. Because without that awareness, you remain stuck. You continue moving in the same direction, unaware of where it leads. This is why many people avoid self-reflection, not because they don't have time, but because they sense what they might find, and they are not ready to face it. But avoiding it does not change reality. It only delays confrontation, and the longer that delay continues, the more difficult it becomes to reverse, because patterns become stronger, habits become deeper, and the conscience becomes quieter. But here is the truth that breaks through all of that. No matter how quiet your conscience has become, it is not gone. It is still there, waiting, responding, ready to be reactivated. But it requires your attention. It requires your honesty. It requires your willingness to listen again, because the moment you begin to pay attention, the signal returns. At first, it is faint, barely noticeable, easy to ignore. But if you continue to listen, it grows stronger, clearer, more defined, and with that clarity comes direction. You begin to see what needs to change. You begin to understand what has been misaligned. You begin to feel the difference between what is right and what is merely comfortable. And that is where transformation begins again. Not in a dramatic moment, but in a quiet shift, a decision to stop ignoring what you feel, a decision to start listening again, because your conscience was never meant to control you, it was meant to guide you. And when it is functioning properly, it becomes one of the most powerful tools you have. Not to restrict your life, but to align it. Not to limit your freedom, but to protect it. But that only happens if you are willing to hear it. And in a world full of noise, distraction, and constant stimulation, listening has become one of the rarest and most powerful choices you can make. Because sometimes the truth is not hidden, it is simply quiet, and sin keeps it that way, by making sure you never stop long enough to hear it. Sin creates distance, and you don't even notice it happening. One of the most devastating effects of sin is not immediate destruction, visible collapse, or dramatic consequences. It is distance, slow, silent, almost invisible distance. And the reason it is so dangerous is because you rarely feel it happening in real time. There is no alarm, no sudden break, no clear moment where everything changes. Instead, it happens gradually, like drifting, not falling, drifting. At first, everything seems the same. Your life continues, your routines remain, your conversations, your thoughts, your daily patterns, they all feel familiar. Nothing appears drastically different, and that is exactly why it is so deceptive, because distance does not always feel like loss. Sometimes it feels like normal life. This is how sin operates at its deepest level. It does not always destroy instantly. It separates slowly. It creates space between you and truth, between you and clarity, between you and purpose, between you and the presence of something greater than yourself. And the most unsettling part is this: you can be far away and still feel close. You can be disconnected and still feel functional. You can be drifting and still feel stable, because the human mind adapts quickly to new baselines. What once felt distant becomes normal. What once felt empty becomes acceptable. What once felt misaligned becomes familiar, and so you continue moving forward, unaware that you are no longer where you used to be. This distance shows up in subtle ways: a lack of clarity, a quiet confusion, a sense that something is off, but you cannot explain what. A loss of depth in your thinking, a decrease in your awareness, a feeling of going through life rather than being fully present in it. But because these changes are gradual, they are easy to ignore, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. You tell yourself you are just tired, just busy, just going through a phase. But deep down, there is something else, something harder to define, a sense that you are no longer as connected as you once were, not necessarily to other people, but to something within yourself, to your purpose, to your direction, to your sense of meaning. This is the effect of distance, and the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to recognize. Because once distance becomes your normal, you lose reference. You forget what closeness felt like. You forget what clarity felt like. You forget what alignment felt like. And without that reference, there is nothing to compare your current state to. So you assume everything is fine. You assume this is just life. You assume this is how things are supposed to feel, but it is not. You were not created to live in a constant state of disconnection. You were not meant to move through life without clarity, without direction, without awareness. And yet, that is where many people find themselves, not because they chose it consciously, but because they drifted into it. And sin is the force behind that drift. Not always through obvious actions, but through subtle misalignments, small decisions, quiet compromises, repeated patterns that slowly pull you away from where you are meant to be. And the further you drift, the less sensitive you become to that movement. Until one day, something happens. A moment of reflection, a sudden realization, a situation that forces you to pause. And for a brief moment, you see clearly. You recognize the distance, you feel it, you understand that something is not right. But then comes the most important moment. What do you do with that awareness? Because awareness alone is not enough. You can recognize the distance and still remain there. You can feel the misalignment and still continue in the same direction. This is where many people get stuck. They see it, they feel it. They even acknowledge it, but they do not act on it, because closing that distance requires effort. It requires change. It requires stepping out of what has become comfortable, even if that comfort is empty. It requires returning. And returning is not always easy, because the further you have drifted, the more unfamiliar the path back feels. It feels uncomfortable. It feels unnatural. It feels like starting over, but here is the truth. You are never as far as you think. The distance may feel large, but the moment you turn, the process of closing it begins. Not instantly, not perfectly, but intentionally. One decision, one shift, one step in the right direction, and with each step, clarity begins to return. Awareness begins to sharpen. Connection begins to rebuild. Not because everything changes at once, but because direction has changed. And direction is everything. Because sin is not just about where you are, it is about where you are heading. And if you continue drifting in the wrong direction, the distance will only increase. But if you turn, even slightly, you begin moving toward alignment again, toward clarity, toward purpose, toward truth. And that is the part most people never realize. The goal is not perfection. The goal is direction. Because perfection is unattainable, but direction is a choice. Every day, every moment, every decision, you are either moving closer or drifting further. There is no neutral, no standing still, no pause in that movement. And once you understand that, everything changes. Because you begin to see your life differently, not as a series of isolated actions, but as a continuous direction, a path, a trajectory. And that trajectory is shaped by the smallest choices, the quiet decisions, the internal shifts that no one else sees, but that define everything. So the real question is not, am I perfect? The real question is, am I moving closer or further away? Because the answer to that question determines everything else, and once you are honest about it, you gain the power to change it, to stop drifting, to start moving, to close the distance, and to return to a place you may not even realize you have left. But once you find it again, you will recognize it instantly, because it was never unfamiliar, it was just forgotten.